Hi, Gary Stearman. Welcome to another Prophecy Watchers Daily Update, and we have a guest in studio with us today, David Schnittger of Southwest Prophecy Ministries. David, welcome to Prophecy Watchers.
It's great to be back with you, Gary.
And we've been talking about your book on another program that we're doing, but I thought I'd take a few minutes and just introduce you to David and his book, Zechariah, Israel, and Her Coming King. You've written a book on Zechariah, and my first question to you is, why in the world did you write a book on Zechariah?
Well, that's a great question, Gary. I have been interested in the book all the way back to my Bible college days, back in the Dark Ages. I had an assignment in my Old Testament class on basically doing a report on Zechariah. And I have to admit, I knew very little about it, so I did some research on it and wrote a paper and stuck it in my file folder until about a few years ago. And the Lord just kind of stirred my heart to expand on that. So for the last four years or so, I thought it was an unusual book, Gary, because it dealt with not only prophecies concerning the future, which other Old Testament books like Daniel or Isaiah, but it also had prophecies concerning the first coming of Christ. And so to see both of those together in a fairly small book, only 14 chapters, tucked away at the end of the Old Testament, it just intrigued me. And so as much as for anything else, I studied it to gain an understanding. And particularly the first 6 chapters, which just on first glance just seemed impregnable to the understanding. You know, you've got ephods, you've got candelabras, you've got myrtle trees, and you've got witnesses, and it's like I don't have a clue as to what that's about. So I just started basically studying it for my own edification. And along the way, there were some topics that kind of intrigued me. So I thought, you know what, I need to write a book on this. And I did.
There you have it. And here's the interesting thing about Zechariah, so-called a minor prophet, next to the last book in the Old Testament, not a minor prophet at all in terms of his message, because he talks about the salvation of Judah in the last days. He talks about the branch, the first coming. He talks about the priesthood, talks about the temple. He talks about all sorts of fascinating subjects that you find in large measure elsewhere in the Bible, and you sort of tend to gloss over Zechariah. Well, you know, what can he add to the discussion? Except that when you go there, he adds a whole lot to the discussion, right?
It really does, really does.
And the way he talks about Jerusalem, you know, it's literally the center of the world. It's the center of God's plan. Today, what do you hear when you hear the name Jerusalem? Conflict. Trouble.
Yeah.
And it looks like Israel is going to lose Jerusalem forever, right?
It really does. It really does. Of course, when President Trump said that U.S. was going to be moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, there was just an explosion of opposition from the likely suspects, the neighbors, etc. I think even the Pope weighed in on it. There seems to be universal opposition to what would seem to be, in other countries, a very routine development. And so it's like there's something different about Israel. And to find out what's different about it, you have to go to the Bible. And again, Jerusalem is, everything you read about Jerusalem in the last 5 chapters is almost synonymous with trouble and conflict and siege and warfare. And it's like a very troubled picture. But it all assumes a literal understanding of Bible prophecy, and that the literal nation of Israel, 2,000 years in dispersion by a miracle of God, is back in the land.
You know, I'm just thinking as you're talking, we live in a world where futures are decided by great wars. You can go back in history and look at all the great wars. World War I, you had the rise of communism. You had the rise of the German war machine. World War II, you had the rise again of communism. And you had not only the German, but the Japanese war machine. And then there was a time when people were thinking, it looks like the United States and the free world may lose this war. You know, it was a rough time.
Very close.
Out of that came what? Israel returned to the land and became a state in 1948. And we live in this kind of a world that is determined by these large wars that occur. Well, you look at Zechariah, he's talking about the very same thing. In Zechariah 12, he mentions Jerusalem as a cup of trembling, and the next words out of his mouth are warfare, and Israel wins the war.
Right, right.
So, it's almost a reinforcement to what we see with our own eyes right now, except the end of the story is given here.
It really is. And it takes, I think for serious students of the Word of God, it engages our best efforts in terms of, okay, we believe the Bible is the Word of God, every word is inspired, but when is this going to happen? It arouses our imagination in terms of saying, now when does Jerusalem become a cup of trembling? Is it a specific event that is being described here? And how does that relate to today? I think it's one of the larger issues in terms of how much should we expect the Bible prophecy being fulfilled during the church age?
Right.
And there are a variety of views on that, which makes for some very interesting discussions. At the very least, I think we would be safe to say that God is setting the table. If Zechariah 12 is not being fulfilled today, we're getting closer day by day as we feel the trembling.
It looks like it is being fulfilled. I mean, how can you look at Zechariah 12:2, where it says, "Behold, I'll make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all people round about." That's a future prophecy, except how future is it? I mean, it's happening right in front of our eyes.
Now, when the culmination of it will be, we don't know. We don't know. But we know that every day brings us closer to that. And with every political development, the antagonism toward Judah and Jerusalem grows. The threats grow. The attacks grow.
Yeah.
What will spark the conflagration? We don't know.
I'm going to the last chapter here, the 14th chapter and the 12th verse. Years and years ago, I remember when I first read this verse, and this shall be the plague wherewith the Lord shall smite all the people that have fought against Jerusalem. There they are again. Their flesh shall consume away while they stand on their feet. Their eyes shall consume in their holes, and their tongue shall consume away in their mouth. And I can't tell you how many times people have looked at that and said, that looks just exactly like the result of nuclear warfare. That's what happens if a bomb goes off and you're standing anywhere close.
Absolutely. It's a vivid description. Why would we expect this to be allegorical when everything that we've seen thus far in Zechariah is literal?
Literal. And so the literal image of a body melting away while standing on its feet, that's a view of the nuclear age.
It really is.
So
yeah. And how could Zechariah have known that, apart from divine inspiration?
Exactly.
And Zechariah probably didn't understand what was intended by this, obviously, but we do. We can have a greater confidence that, God prefigured nuclear warfare in Zechariah 14. Another testimony of divine inspiration. We couldn't have made this up, Gary.
No, could not. And this is the wonderful thing about Zechariah. It's the little prophecy that almost gets lost in the Bible, but it's super important. The name of the prophet, Zechariah, and I know you know this, it's a composite in the Hebrew, Zechariah. And it means God remembers. And boy, isn't that the theme of the prophecy?
It really is. That God has not forgotten his people. After 70 years of suffering, and they go back to their homeland and it's just destroyed. It's a mess. Yeah. And Zechariah says, God remembers.
God remembers. He never forgets. There is a tendency, and we're sitting here, I was just thinking about another thing. We're sitting here very close to the time when there was recently in Hawaii a false nuclear warning issued over the sea phones of people on the island. And we've seen in the news the panic, dire panic when people realize, wait a minute, I've got maybe no more than 10 minutes.
People were putting their children in storm drains. They were so panicked.
And so we do live in a nuclear age. We tend to kind of cover it up and forget about it, but God remembers.
Right, he does.
So it's a fascinating prophecy. Again, David's written this book, Zechariah, Israel, and Her Coming King. We have this in our online bookstore, along with you may find very interesting an accompanying DVD, which is, by the way, a PowerPoint, right?
Yes, it's a 20-minute short course in Messianic prophecy.
Very short
20
course.
minutes. It's a crash course.
Messianic prophecy. Now, when you talk about Messianic prophecy and Zechariah, what are you talking about?
We're talking first coming and second coming. Zechariah predicts the triumphal entry of Christ, the betrayal of Christ by Judas in great detail, and of course multiple prophecies concerning Christ's second coming. Where he's going to land, what's going to happen when he lands on Mount Zion, where he's going to go, and what's going to happen next. I mean, it's all laid out in Zechariah.
The where he's going to land, that just jogged me. So where's he going to land?
He's going to land on Mount Zion. According to the Mount of Olives specifically in Zechariah 14:4, his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof, toward the east and toward the west. So the Bible predicts that Jesus is going to come back on the Mount of Olives, which, by the way, that's where he left from, Acts chapter 1.
It is.
And there will be a great earthquake that takes place when he does.
Now, here's the fascinating thing. The reason I took this little detour is just to say, when you go to Israel today, one of the touring spots, one of the places you go to is the Mount of Olives, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Got to go
I've been there.
I'm sure you have. And that's how real this prophecy is. You read the book, and it says his feet are going to actually land on that place where thousands of tourists gather right now when they go to Israel.
Yeah. That really brings the immediacy of this book.
It does.
And it was written 2,500 years ago, Gary.
Yeah.
And it's just as immediate as today's newspaper.
Well, it's fascinating. You need to read David Schnittger's book. It is called Zechariah, Israel, and Her Coming King. Pleasure to talk with you, and may the Lord bless your work.
Thank you, Gary. The pleasure's all mine.
David Schnittger, and you're going to really enjoy the book. It's a good read. I'm Gary Stearman. Keep watching. We are. Thanks for joining us on Prophecy Watchers. You can find us on the web at prophecywatchers.com, where you can sign up for our free email newsletter. In the meantime, keep watching, everybody, and we'll see you soon.